On the night of February the 28th, 1943, a 9-man team of British-trained Norwegian resistance fighters carried out a daring act of sabotage that echoed around the world. Their target was the heavy water plant situated at Vemork in the Telemark region, 150 miles from Oslo. Towering above the plant was the infamous Hardangervidda, a frozen plateau renowned for its inhospitable terrain and ferocious winter weather. Standing on a cliff, accessible only by a bridge across a deep gorge, Vemork was thought by the Germans to be impregnable. The raid that night was to prove them disastrously wrong, and dealt a fatal blow to Hitler's long-term war aims. In 1943, Germany and America were locked in a deadly race to be the first to create the atomic bomb. Whoever won the race would possess a weapon that could end the war at a stroke. Heavy water, D2O, which is rich in the rare isotope of hydrogen known as deuterium, was considered indispensable to moderate nuclear reactions. In 1943, Vemork was the only plant in the world where heavy water was produced continuously. Ironically, when they set out from their SOE base in Britain, none of the 9 men involved in the raid had any notion of its vital significance.
None of us had ever heard about the atomic bomb. But when my group left, Colonel Wilson said to me that this job is very, very important. If the Germans get hold of heavy water, they will be able to blow up some part of London or world like that. Well, I didn't believe him. He's telling me this because he wants us to do a good job. But the first I knew about the atomic bomb was when the bomb fell on Hiroshima.
The Vemork sabotage operation was a complete success. Surveying the damage, Generaloberst Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, head of the Wehrmacht forces in Norway, described the raid as the most splendid coup I have seen in this war. It was a coup that could only have been carried out by men with intimate local knowledge, an inbred capacity to cope with the harsh terrain, and sharply honed survival skills. In other words, by native Norwegians. The path to effective organized resistance had been a long and painful one for Norway. It began when the German army launched Operation Weserübung on the 9th of April 1940, sweeping into Norway and Denmark in a meticulously planned lightning assault that succeeded in placing German troops on the streets of Oslo and Copenhagen within the first 24 hours. Citizens in both capitals were stunned by the speed of the occupation and appalled by the violation of their neutrality. The swastika was run up the flagpole of the Akershus fort, the headquarters of the Norwegian military, even as German troops were seizing control of airfields and the country's main coastal towns: Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, Kristiansand and Narvik. But the shock of events did not prevent the Norwegians from achieving one vital victory on the day of invasion, when they sank the German heavy cruiser Blücher in Oslo Fjord with coastal gunfire. This allowed King Haakon VII to make good his escape from the capital, along with the government and other members of the Storting, the Norwegian parliament. When the Germans demanded Norway's capitulation, Haakon refused point blank. In Oslo, Vidkun Quisling, leader of the Norwegian Nazi Party, announced that he had temporarily taken over the reins of power and declared resistance to German troops a crime. It was a time of choice for the Norwegian people. Gunnar Stensteby, a resistance fighter and Norway's most decorated military hero, sums up the feelings of the population at that time.
To begin with, it was all a shock to everybody. So in the first period, it was very difficult what to do, but we understood that we had now got the Nazi tyranny, which was well known in Germany. Well, hadn't realized what they have been through, I think. But we had it now and felt it for 5 years.
The weeks that followed the German invasion were confused and chaotic. British, French and Polish troops fought alongside the Norwegians in a doomed attempt to win back Trondheim and to throw the Germans out of Narvik in the north. It was from here that iron ore, freighted by rail from the Swedish mines at Gällivare, was exported to Germany. In the final week of May, Allied forces succeeded in recapturing the port. But with France crumbling under the onslaught of von Rundstedt's panzers, the British troops in Norway could no longer be supported. They were desperately needed elsewhere. On the 31st of May, the order was given to evacuate Narvik. By June the 7th, most of the Allied troops had embarked, leaving Norway to its fate at the hands of the Germans. On the same day, King Haakon and his cabinet boarded HMS Devonshire at Tromsø and sailed for England. It would be 5 years before he returned to Norwegian soil. 3 days later, Norway capitulated. The doomed Allied campaign in Norway during the early summer of 1940 had an important political effect in Britain. It was the final nail in the coffin of Neville Chamberlain's government. On the 10th of May, he resigned and was replaced by Winston Churchill. As acting First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill's own part in the abortive Norwegian campaign had not been blameless. But the country wanted as its leader someone who, by his implacable opposition to the policy of appeasement, gave notice of a new determination to stand up to Hitler. For the time being, however, there was very little anybody could do to help the Norwegians, who were coming to terms with living under the Nazi yoke.
It was a general feeling that maybe the war was lost, and remaining politicians in Norway, they got into some sort of negotiations with the Germans. What the Germans wanted was to create a new regime, and they persuaded in various ways Norwegian politicians to let go of the government, renouncing the government, and even urging the king to abdicate. His answer, which was in fact written by the foreign minister, was given in a speech from London, which cleared everything. It was a resounding no to abdication, and making it very clear that the government in exile was Norway's government. That was a really morale booster for most Norwegians.
But for a country that hadn't been engaged in war for 125 years, learning how to resist an occupying power was hard. At first, there was no question of any kind of armed resistance. There were no underground networks, no arms, no support from abroad, no men trained in sabotage and guerrilla warfare. Inevitably, the first signs of resistance came from among ordinary civilians.
The paperclip is thought to be a Norwegian invention. during the occupation, people started wearing paper clips in their jackets, almost like that, as a demonstration, as a symbol. We cling together, we keep together. So it was a sign of national unity against the German and the Norwegian Nazis. So this was one of many such signs which can be categorized as the paperclip spirit, maybe.
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
This found expression in an almost universal hatred of Quisling and the Norwegian Nazi party, the Nationalsamling. In the autumn of 1940, Reichskommissar Josef Terborfen abolished all other political parties and formally installed Quisling as Prime Minister.
Quisling does struggle to gain popular support. He was the head of a minority party, probably didn't get more than 2 or 3% of the vote prior to the war, and although he hoped to get a membership of about 100,000 during the war, he only gets a membership of 35,000. Whereas the king remains, how shall we say, the heart of Norwegian society, providing a focus, a centre of unity, I think, for the Norwegian population. He's broadcasting, of course, from Britain. And you have a fairly homogenous society actively opposed, at least mentally, to the German occupation.
For most civilians, resistance was passive. It took the form of a dogged refusal to cooperate. One of the first groups to make their feelings known were the country's sportsmen, who went on strike, refusing to take any part in Nazi-run competitions. In December 1940, the Supreme Court protested against Nazi encroachments on the rule of law, and leading judges resigned en masse. In 1941, 22 civil service organizations issued a letter of protest to Terborfen. Many professionals from all walks of life, including engineers, lawyers, accountants and dentists, joined what they saw as an ideological struggle for the soul of their country by utterly refusing to cooperate.
The Nazi party tried to get hold of the organizations, so it was really, to a large extent, a battle for organizational Norway. And so lots of these organizations were voluntarily disbanding themselves and went underground. So you had networks of doctors and lawyers and such kinds, and even teachers and even officers. So that was the first thing I think. Organizational networks.
Early in 1941, the country's Lutheran Church issued a powerful statement condemning the new administration and rallying the populace. Eventually, the struggle came to a head over the issue of a new catechism demanding obedience to the party. The bishops resigned en masse, followed by 797 of the country's 858 incumbent clergy. Many leading churchmen of various denominations were arrested and interned or banished from their parishes.
The Norwegian church is empty, and they protest, believe it or not, to the Reichskommissar, Josef Terborfen, essentially the German ruler of Norway, above Quisling's head. And Terborfen, always keen to embarrass Quisling, didn't like him very much, didn't really rate him or his party, actually tells Quisling to drop this. Essentially, when it came down to it, the Norwegians could get away with civil resistance on issues like this, so long as it didn't undermine overall German control or undermine production for the German economy.
In accordance with that policy, when a wave of unofficial strikes occurred in 1941, the ringleaders were arrested and shot. The Nazis also made persistent efforts to introduce their ideology through school textbooks and directives. In February 1942, they attempted to organize all teachers and enforce national service for all young people along the lines of the Hitler Youth. The teachers refused to pledge loyalty to the regime, and 12,000 of the 14,000-strong profession openly protested at the youth program. 1,300 of them were arrested at random, and many were sent to concentration camps to suffer hard labor.
After 1 year, many had died, but they didn't give in. So the Germans and the Norwegian Nazis, was a few of them, they gave up to Nazified schools. They wanted the young schoolchildren to put in uniform, Nazi uniform, but they highly refused. They did never force it on the Norwegian population. And one thing was very strange. It was about more than 300,000 housewives. They wrote the letter and they said, "We refuse that you take our children into Nazi uniform." So it was a fine job from a very important part of the population.
Amongst those most in danger from the Gestapo were the true Norwegians, who almost from the very start of the occupation were determined to preserve free speech and counter Nazi propaganda. Many of them contained news derived from broadcasts by the BBC, heard throughout Norway on illegal radios.
The people had been brave enough to keep their radios that took down the news. And they had a typewriter and they had piece of paper, and they copied this. And so it started actually what we call illegal newspapers, but it was actually secret newspapers with all world news. So in the first 2-3 years it went fairly well, but then in that period about more than 5,000 were discovered as newspaper people, and they were sent to Germany, concentration camps in Germany, to die more or less. And so many as 220 editors, newspaper reporters were killed, they were shot because they did this anti-propaganda.
As elsewhere, prison camps were a routine part of the apparatus of Nazi repression. There were over a dozen in Norway. The largest of these was Grini in the outskirts of Oslo, which also acted as a transit camp for prisoners on their way to camps in Germany or elsewhere. Approximately 50,000 Norwegians were arrested by the Germans during the occupation, 9,000 of whom were sent on to Germany. 1,400 of them died. More than half of these were Jews, around 40% of Norway's tiny Jewish population of 2,000.
Luckily, around 60% got away to Sweden, but some 760, 770 maybe, were actually arrested by the Nazis with, sadly enough, assistance from the Norwegian police. And they were all sent to German concentration camps, Auschwitz, most of them, and less than 30 survived.
The worst of the concentration camps inside Norway were those constructed in the far north in Vemork, especially to hold Russian prisoners. Over 100,000 prisoners were held in appallingly primitive conditions and used for slave labor. After the war, 17,000 bodies were found. To support its soldiers in Russia, Germany requisitioned goods from the Norwegian population. Items such as blankets, boots, tents, rucksacks and wind cheaters had to be handed in. Failure to comply was punished by 3 years' imprisonment. Severe rationing was enforced, and the population came to depend on food parcels from Sweden and Denmark. On occasions, Danish soup was all that stood between Norway's children and starvation. Some items like leather goods disappeared altogether. Replacements included such things as paper shoes with wooden soles and fish scale handbags. It was a miserable time for ordinary people. As Nazi repression became more brutal, an increasing number of Norwegians looked to Sweden as a safe haven. In the early months of the war, Sweden had only preserved its neutrality and independence by coming to an accommodation with the Nazis. The Swedish government had even refused King Haakon safe passage through their country when Norway fell to the German invasion.
Certainly in the early days, you might well be interned if you escaped into Sweden, and there are certainly cases of German deserters being handed back to the German authorities. But I suppose the real importance of Sweden is it provides a refuge for the Norwegian resistance. If things are getting too hot, you can escape across that long and difficult to police border. And it was fairly easy, once you got to Stockholm, if you're important enough of course, to be shuttled back to Britain on a mosquito.
It was very important for Norway that Sweden was neutral. It was extremely valuable. And more than 50,000 Norwegians saved their lives getting out of the border to Sweden. And they were very well treated and taken care of in Sweden. But I would say 50,000 were saved because of a neutral Sweden.
Norway's long border with Sweden was matched to the west by an equally long coastline, some 2,650 kilometres, easily accessible from the Shetlands and the UK mainland. It provided a means for escape for some 3,300 Norwegians. Fishing boats carried most of them, but some smaller and less seaworthy craft were used, and around 3,000 were shipwrecked. The young Norwegians who escaped to Britain by boat or via Sweden formed the core of the wing of military resistance that carried on the fight from abroad and helped to give that government credibility in the eyes of the population at home. But it should not be forgotten that one section of the Norwegian population had been deeply involved in the struggle against the Nazis right from the start: the sailors of the Merchant Marine. When Germany invaded Norway, the Norwegian Merchant Marine consisted of 1,172 vessels, totaling more than 4.4 million tons. 252 of these, totaling almost 2 million tons, were tankers. At that time, agreements between Britain and Norway meant that Britain had already chartered nearly 2 million gross tons, including 60% of the tanker fleet. After the invasion, Quisling ordered all Norwegian ships to make for German, Italian or neutral ports. But the Norwegian government in London managed to requisition the fleet, thus gaining for itself a major bargaining chip with its British hosts and a substantial revenue earner throughout the war. What Britain gained was a lifeline.
We had the third biggest merchant fleet in the world. We had the most modern tanker fleet in the world, so we could supply London, England, when England had no supplies. The first 2 years of the war, that were more or less dependent on the Norwegian tankers. First of all, supplies of gasoline and oils. That was very important. They said our war started September 39 with our merchant navy, because they were torpedoed from that time on when they went to Allied harbors, which they did all the time.
Norwegian merchant ships played a major part in the Battle of the Atlantic and in all Allied seaborne operations throughout the war. The cost in lives and ships was appalling. In 1940, 216 ships were lost. In 1942, a Norwegian ship was lost every other day. By the end of the war, over 50% of the fleet had been lost, at a cost of 3,743 lives. With a legitimate government in London and young men flocking to join the fight, Norway's commitment to the Allied cause was not in any doubt. The problem that now faced the authorities in London and at home was how to organise an effective military resistance without jeopardising the civilian population. For various reasons, this problem was to prove singularly difficult to overcome in the years that followed. The Resistance Museum in Oslo is housed in an old building in Akershus Castle next to a memorial that marks the spot where Norwegian patriots were executed by the German occupying forces. Their death was part of a bitterly hard learning process for a peace-loving population with no great military tradition and no experience of organised resistance to an invader.
Resistance had to be invented, had to be taught, had to be learned. The military organisation, the Milorg, was formed gradually, and in the autumn of 1941 it was authorised by the Norwegian government in London.
Milorg was slow to expand and at first avoided action and even weapons, gradually building up a secret centralised army and preparing quietly for the day of liberation. Its intention was to go slow, lie low, and by not attracting attention, avoid placing the lives of ordinary citizens at risk.
There were, of course, difficulties. Norway was quite an open society. People weren't great at keeping secrets. This is certainly a theme that seems to run through British cooperation with the Norwegians. And the Gestapo did manage to penetrate certain groups on the west coast in 1941 with, roundups and arrests that follow. But I think by late 1941, this has been got over, and we see them moving towards something of a more effective, more homogeneous resistance movement.
Coordinating resistance under the harshly repressive Nazi regime was a severe challenge because Norway suffered the highest level of occupation of any country in Europe. 250,000 troops by 1942, rising to over 400,000 by the end of the war, 1 German for every 8 Norwegians. And in a country where bridges and ferry crossings create natural bottlenecks, policing the population through identity cards was comparatively easy.
I had to leave my home in Oslo, of course. I had a room rented there, and I had now different passports. I had to make a new passport in the name of Andersen instead of Sønsteby, and later on it was discovered by the secret police, and then I had to shift. So, and I stayed now from 42. I had almost 10 hideouts. So I had no difficulties to keep away from the Gestapo.
One way that Norwegians could make a serious contribution to the war was to supply intelligence to the Allies. For more urgent intelligence, there was a network of wireless operators, particularly along the coast. Their task was to watch the movements of the German fleet along Norway's jagged coastline.
Norway is only really important in British strategy when it comes to the German Navy, which virtually the entire surface fleet is based there. And for the British, the threat that this might initially break out into the Atlantic, later on attack the Arctic convoys, is of major significance.
This network, operated jointly by SIS and the Norwegian Intelligence Office in London, grew rapidly. Their most celebrated success was the sustained 2-year observation of the battleship Tirpitz as it moved from one hiding place to another. She was finally destroyed by bombing near Tromsø in 1944. Inland, Milorg set up a further 70 stations of its own, using secretly built equipment. And SOE had its own networks. all of them were highly vulnerable to sophisticated German direction-finding techniques. Records show that the Norwegian Intelligence Office in London handled nearly 6,000 radio reports and 20,000 reports by courier in the course of the war. The contribution these agents made to the eventual Allied victory is incalculable. Jens Anton Paulsen was among the thousands of young men who escaped from Norway and ended up in England looking for a chance to take the fight back to the enemy. He joined Norwegian Independent Company No. 1, known as the Martin Linge Company after its founder. Members of the company underwent rigorous fitness training and learnt sabotage techniques under the overall control of the Special Operations Executive, SOE.
I went through all the SOE courses, well, 2 or 3 at that time I think, and later on I believe I have been through most of the courses the SOE was running. Norwegian Independent Company No. 1. We got a very nice place in Scotland, in the Vemork area, with the Cairngorm Mountains and country. It was very similar to Norway, very good place to stay and train for Norwegian.
Many SOE-trained agents were on their way back to Norway via what became known as the Shetland Bus, a clandestine ferry operation consisting of fishing boats. It was an extremely hazardous operation, often undertaken in foul weather and heavy seas, and with the constant risk of capture or worse. SOE's Shetland base was also used to launch commando raids against German forces and installations in Norway. One such raid was the Claymore operation against the Lofoten Islands on the 4th of March 1941. Undertaken without the prior knowledge of the Norwegian government in London, who protested on behalf of their citizens who suffered reprisals, with homes burnt and people arrested. Norwegian commandos who had taken part in the raid felt disillusioned and began to doubt whether it was right to operate under British orders to achieve British military objectives. This view was compounded by the death of Martin Linge in the Anklet raid against Måløy in December 1941.
Milorg, of course, is operating under a philosophy that they are saving their strength for the day that the liberation comes, and thus can be an effective sort of secret army in support of any Allied landings in Norway. And they're husbanding their strength while SOE are coming in and causing trouble, which of course often leads to crackdowns, and that leads to tension between the two groups. Indeed, amongst SOE there is a belief that Milorg is a bunch of dangerous amateurs and should be avoided at all cost.
1942 was a bad year for Milorg. Many of its networks were penetrated, hundreds were arrested, 24 of its leaders and a number of innocent citizens were shot. The setbacks brought about a wholesale revision of Milorg's strategy. The choice was stark. It could remain poorly trained, poorly equipped and vulnerable, or it could become a decentralized, fully trained and armed guerrilla organization. For that, it needed London's help. The most famous action involving SOE-trained soldiers of the Linge Company was the Gunnerside operation against the heavy water plant at Vemork in February 1943. It was vital to Norwegian interests that the attack should be carried out by saboteurs, because a bombing raid would be hazardous to the local population. A 4-man team, codenamed Grouse, was dropped onto the nearby Hardanger Plateau by parachute on the 18th of October 1942 to make contact with SOE's undercover agent working at the plant, Einar Skinnaland, codenamed Swallow.
We were dropped quite a long way from the operational area, and that was because we were going to drop blind. There was no reception committee on the ground. So I wanted to be quite sure that we wouldn't get in touch with any German patrols and so on. It took us 14 days to move that short distance because of all the equipment we had to bring with us.
The plan was for grouse to base itself in a commandeered skiing hut and prepare for a glider-borne commando attack that was scheduled to occur a month after their arrival. 34 Royal Engineers were to make the commando raid. Its codename was Freshman. In the event, it was a catastrophe. Both gliders crashed, one near Leisefjord and the other near Egersund. The few survivors of the impact, many of them badly wounded, were rounded up by the Gestapo, tortured and shot.
The Freshman operation was a disaster. They were very unlucky. One of the problems was that the lights we have got, there was ordinary British Army flashlights, and I think they weren't good enough. Later in the war we used more powerful lights. So if you had had good lights who spread their beam better, I'm sure they would have found us.
The grouse team were ordered to remain in place to prepare for a second attempt. They withdrew up into the wilderness of the Hardanger Plateau, out of reach of German patrols, to await orders. In the event, they were forced to survive the incredibly harsh conditions for another 4 months. For days on end, they would be pinned down in their hut by howling wind and driving snow. On more than one occasion, they came close to starvation.
The most important was to stay alive, and that meant wood for our stove in the hut we had frozen, and it meant food. The day before Christmas, I shot the first reindeer, and we spent a very, very nice Christmas eating, and eating.
Back in London, it was decided not to try another commando raid, but to send in a second small team of SOE-trained Norwegians to complete the job. Their leader was Second Lieutenant Joachim Rønneberg. The operation was codenamed Gunnerside. On the 16th of February, after many delays and flights aborted by bad weather, the 6-man team dropped onto the Hardanger Plateau. It was 6 days before they made contact with the grouse team.
The problem was, when we got a message that they had landed, a tremendous snowstorm broke up. So we were very anxious about them. After a week, the weather cleared and went up to Lake Kalungsjön to look up for them, and I met them. So it was a very happy reunion. We all knew each other from England, from Scotland.
The combined party quickly decided that the best line of attack was to drop down into the gorge, cross the ice-bound river at the bottom, and attempt to climb the sheer cliff on the other side. A route that is still considered to be treacherous today. But despite the dangers, this route was their only means of escape. So they would have to complete the operation without alerting any of the German guards. On the day of the attack, Helberg, one of the Gunnerside team, recce'd the route and declared it possible. The only problem was that a thaw had set in.
Because of the mild weather, there was quite a lot of water in the river, and there was only one ice bridge to cross at that place. If that had also had gone, we would have been we must have looked for another place, and that would have been very difficult.
The wet snow made the going hard, and in the bottom of the gorge the rapidly thawing ice cracked and groaned as they made their way across the river. By 1:45 they were safely out of the gorge and hiding only a few hundred yards from their objective, the looming bulk of the Vemork plant. At 3 a.m. they made their silent assault, cutting through the thick chain lock on the giant wire mesh gates and taking up their positions in the compound. 2 members of the demolition team, Rønneberg and Kaiser, made their way along a narrow cable shaft and dropped down into the cellar where the machinery that concentrated the heavy water was situated. There they overpowered the Norwegian night watchman, and Rønneberg set about placing explosives on the cylinders of water. 25 minutes later, they released the night watchman and burst out of the steel door of the cellar into the night. A few seconds later, they heard the dull thud of the explosion. The sound was muffled by the noise of the factory and the thick concrete walls. In that moment, Hitler's atomic scientists lost 3,000 pounds of heavy water, about 4 months' production. At the sound of the explosion, the door of the nearby German barracks hut swung open and a half-dressed soldier appeared, flashing a torch. The beam passed inches above the head of one of the hiding saboteurs. After listening for a while, the sentry turned and walked slowly back to his hut.
Today we know the reason why no shot was fired was because the Germans didn't do that job. The German guards didn't do that job. But we were very, very lucky. I believe the British, as a saying, you get what luck you deserve. Maybe we deserved it, I don't know. But at least we were very, very, very lucky.
Once safe in the mountains, the party split up. Some of them were to stay in Norway, while 5 were to make an epic 400-kilometer journey across the Hardangervidda to the Swedish border. It was several days before London learnt that the raid had been a complete success. SOE was jubilant, as was Downing Street. But more than anything else, it was a huge victory for Norway and those of its citizens who had chosen to resist the German tyranny. The Germans worked frantically to repair the damaged machinery at Vemork. The SOE undercover agent Schinneland told London that the plant would be back in full production by August. Once again, the Americans raised the possibility of bombing the plant, and this time the plan was accepted, but only because the Norwegian government and High Command were not told about it. On the 16th of November, a fleet of 300 flying fortresses and liberators took off from East Anglia and headed for Vemork. Only 18 of them hit the plant. The heavy water high concentration cells escaped almost intact. 22 local citizens were killed. The Norwegian authorities in London were incandescent with rage. The Germans decided to remove all remaining stocks of heavy water to Germany in February 1944. On Sunday the 24th of February, Norwegian saboteurs placed a bomb in the bow of the hydro ferry that would transport the rail wagons containing the heavy water across Lake Tinsha on Sunday the 20th of February. The bomb exploded as planned at 10:45, sending the ferry and its cargo to the bottom. Sadly, 14 Norwegian passengers were drowned. But once again, the point had been proved that a small team of highly motivated and well-trained Norwegian saboteurs could achieve what a massive bombing raid could not.
Once the British and Americans, who of course are quite well developed on their atomic project at this time, discover the Germans are working on the same thing, this has to be stopped. And of course we should remember, Heisenberg, the head of the German atomic bomb project's biographer, actually says the Vemork raid limits the Germans to small-scale reactor experiments. They're not thinking about building a bomb after the raid.
In the final phase of the war, the Norwegian military resistance organisation, Milorg, finally came into its own. With the aid of London, it had gradually been building up its strength.
In early December 1944, a directive was issued by General Eisenhower. The idea was to keep the Germans in Norway. And in order to do that, one should sabotage against railways, shipping and fuel facilities to slow down the transfer of German troops from occupied Norway to the continent. So the Milorg got the opportunity to carry out sabotage.
This actually happened after the German surrender in Finland in the autumn of 1944, when large numbers of troops were withdrawn into Finnmark and thence southwards.
The Allies didn't have any forces to use in Norway at that time. So if he had wanted to fight on it, would have taken a hell of a long time to eliminate him.
In the event, General Burma signed the German surrender in Norway on the 8th of May 1945, and Milorg did not have to fight. Their role in the risky transition period was to stand guard, protect buildings and maintain order. And there was also the matter of rounding up the traitors and collaborationists. Unlike France, which saw a massive bloodletting after the liberation, Norway handled the matter with dignity and due process. Some 25 traitors, including Quisling, were executed. On June the 7th, 1945, 5 years to the day after he had been forced into exile, King Haakon VII set foot on Norwegian soil again. Norway's long nightmare was over.